Sehr, Erfreud, der Podcast der Sigmund Freud Privatuniversität Wien. Präsentiert von Cheyenne Scheuch. Herzlich willkommen zurück bei Sehr, Erfreud. A warm welcome back to very pleased. Admittedly, upon deciding on the podcast's name, I did not consider the English equivalent of it. However, this shall not stop us from bringing this format to you in another language. So today is our first episode fully recorded in English. However, this is actually not the only change today. Today's guest is already familiar to you if you've listened to our previous episodes. Today I welcome back Manuel Jakab, first introduced just 2 episodes ago. Well, I guess soon came sooner in that case. In episode 3, Manuel discussed conspiracy theories with me, both in the realm of sociology, psychotherapy, and their areas of interlacement. Those of you who listened carefully back then might actually be able to guess today's topic that he then teasered as his psychotherapeutical school of choice, motivated by both theoretical and personal affinities. Today, Manuel and I are going to speak about existential therapy. Great, so let's get right to it. I would kindly ask you to explain to me and to our audience, of course, what actually is existential therapy. So maybe give me like a kickstart on it.
Sure. So existential therapy is basically a philosophically grounded form of therapy as compared to purely clinical or psychological approaches that we also know. That means it emphasizes the immediate experience of human existence instead of starting from supposedly objective principles of some alleged mechanisms of the psyche, if you will. So in other words, other than certain forms of psychotherapy which focus on very specific aspects like intrapsychological conflicts, object integration, inferiority, or distortions of rational deliberation, just to give you a few examples, existential therapy attempts nothing less than to explore the human condition in its entirety. So it's not the psyche as such what existential therapy is interested in. It's also the psyche, but not only the psyche. But existential therapy is interested in what Martin Heidegger termed as being in the world. So this being in the world entails, of course, the psychological processes as well, but then also the social and maybe most important, the transcendent, the spiritual dimension. So in that regard, existential therapy is surely one of the most holistic forms of therapy I can think of. Just as a side note, these dimensions of the psyche, the social dimension, the physical and biological world, and the transcendent dimension, they are called Eigenwelt, Mitwelt, Umwelt, and Überwelt in existential lingo. The frequent use of German terms is owed to the fact that many of the central figures in the history of ideas of existential therapy were actually German speaking, as we will see a little later.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense then. So the way you explained it to me now makes it sound somewhat as like a singular thing, but as I have understood previously that it entails a few different schools, the existential realm, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course, yeah. You're right in that point. It has been maybe a little bit imprecise of me to speak of existential therapy as if it was just one single approach, which it isn't. There are, and that is still quite simplified, 3 strands that differ quite a lot, but nevertheless share some basic concepts. Again, we will come back to these common concepts later. But maybe let me expand a little on these three different strands so that our audience gets a basic idea of the traditions there. So the earliest of these three forms of therapy is Daseinsanalysis. That would roughly translate into something like analysis of being in the world. And that dates back to basically the 1930s, 1940s. It's associated with the names Ludwig Binswanger and Medard Boss. These were basically Swiss psychotherapists and psychiatrists, which were also heavily imbued in philosophical thinking. And then a little later came existential analysis and logotherapy. The former is, to again put it in simple terms, kind of the wider concept, and the latter, logotherapy, is basically the practical application of existential analysis, if you will. And both were introduced by Viktor Frankl after the Second World War, where he was heavily building on his personal experience in the concentration camps. And then there is also existential therapy, and actually it doesn't have a more specific name, it's simply called existential therapy. That is of the more transatlantic American tradition, or more rooted in that tradition. It's associated with names like Rollo May, James Bugenthal, Irving Yalom, or more recently, Emmy van Dersen. From her, basically, I've borrowed the terms Eigenwelt, Überwelt, and so forth, I've already mentioned beforehand. So again, all these approaches bring together existential concepts and therapy. These approaches are far from forming a, if you will, homogeneous school of thought. For example, Daseinsanalysis is considered way closer to psychoanalysis, although it also rejects some of its core ideas, while the other ones are maybe even more standalone approaches that have already evolved even further from psychoanalysis. But again, since today we only want to provide some kind of a general overview, I will use the term existential therapy or existential therapies in plural as a generic term and point out differences only when necessary.
Okay. You just mentioned that Daseinsanalysis and psychoanalysis, like that there's some form of closeness, even though some points are being rejected by Daseinsanalysis. However, still, does that mean that existential therapy is some sort of like sprung off psychoanalysis in a way?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. There is indeed that common misconception that existential therapy is basically just a form of psychoanalysis, or at least in the widest sense a form of psychodynamic therapy. I've heard this actually from several colleagues, and I can only speculate where it comes from. Most probably, but that's just my approach. It comes from the fact that most of the proponents of existential therapy, like Frankl, May, or Yalom, were originally trained as psychoanalysts. That's maybe a point. But of course, it doesn't make too much sense to just come to the idea that, okay, because they were basically, as their first vocation was psychoanalysts, to say that all their teachings, all their approaches were actually also some kind of psychoanalysis. Because, for example, the same would be true for Aaron Beck or Albert Ellis. They were also originally trained psychoanalysts. And I guess we can all agree that this doesn't make cognitive behavioral therapy or rational emotive behavioral therapy psychodynamic approaches. That wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah, but are they, like, do they have something in common yet, still?
There are, of course, some psychodynamic concept that existential therapy has adopted, though it usually employs them in quite a different way than in the original Freudian approach. For example, the relevance of anxiety isn't denied, but existential therapy doesn't see it as the result of unresolved, unconscious conflicts, but as a natural and unavoidable reaction to the existential concerns, or the existential givens, as they're also called. And for example, in that regard, Yalom is basically kind of close to Fritz Riemann's idea of the basic anxieties. That's a kind of very central book in psychoanalysis and psychodynamic thinking. And there are some parallels, obviously. And likewise, also the idea of defenses is not abandoned in existential therapy, but the concept of defenses is interpreted as a reaction to existential anxieties rather than a reaction to unwanted desires. So that's, of course, already kind of a difference, although the same concepts or the same terms are used, but they mean something different. Because instead of viewing defense mechanisms like denial, avoidance, or repression as something that is outright maladaptive, if you will, existential therapists try to help clients understand the purpose of these defense mechanisms and try to reframe them in an authentic way. So actually not try to break defenses and power them, but just to reframe defenses and to make use of these mechanisms that can be basically found in every human being as a reaction to the existential givens.
Okay, so there's a lot of things, as I've taken it, that are being interpreted in a different way. Actually, that makes me think, let's just talk about the differences. Now we talked about commonalities. Now I want to know more. What makes them so different then?
Okay, yeah, sure. Let's take a closer look at the essential differences between psychoanalysis and existential therapy, and there are quite a lot. So when I think about it spontaneously, I would say, of course, it's always hard to make a precise list, kind of bullet points, but I would say there are 6 major aspects that come to my mind that are very specific differences between the two schools of thought, if you will. So in the most general sense, to begin with, there is a vastly different view in terms of the role of tension or conflict. For psychoanalysis, the overarching goal is the release of intrapsychic tension, so to achieve an equilibrium, or in other words, homeostasis. And from an existential viewpoint, however, the tension between a person, as she perceives herself on one hand, and what she could become in the future on the other, that tension is not only deemed not something pathological at all, but as, for example, Frankl would put it, even more, it is indispensable for mental health. So the tension is actually something that is needed in order to be able to find a point to start with therapy. That notion bears maybe some commonality with Carl Rogers' concept of incongruence as a necessary prerequisite of therapy. So when there is no incongruence, you can't actually start with therapy. There needs to be some tension. There needs to be something that needs to be remedied. But for existential therapy, basically alleviating the tension is never the goal at all, but is it's not the same as it would be the goal achieving congruence in person-centered therapy, but actually tension is something that will never go away, but we can still use to work with.
So, well, tension is one thing then, obviously. How about the other things you mentioned, like other differences?
Yeah, of course, I've been digressing a little bit into person-centered therapy, but again, differences between existential therapy and psychoanalysis. So maybe let's take a look at the relationship next. In existential therapy, it is very important to establish an authentic, collaborative, and mutual relationship. And that, of course, obviously collides with the psychoanalytic idea of a neutral and detached stance that allow the client's unconscious projections to emerge. So, you know, in psychoanalysis, it's like a blank canvas. But that approach is a blank canvas. It's being completely detached and neutral. That would be something that would be deemed extremely inauthentic from an existential point of view.
So, as I'm understanding understanding right now, we are talking about the client-therapist relationship, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's when I say relationship, that's what I'm referring to. Yeah.
So just from what I know about psychoanalysis, isn't there some kind of motive of hierarchy between therapist and client that is going on, that is to be expected, actually?
Exactly. Yes, that's a good point as well, to expand even more on the relationship. So the therapist in psychoanalysis is, at least in theory, and again, an objective, removed interpreter of the unconscious. And in contrast, in existential therapy, the therapist is an equal explorer of the human condition. So you're on the same level.
Okay, so no hierarchy going on.
There is no hierarchy. No, okay. It's like really being kind of course, basically the therapist is an expert still. But in terms of how the relationship is developed, it's just kind of being on an equal level.
I think you mentioned the unconscious. I want to pick that up because the unconscious is such a buzzword in psychoanalysis that is being thrown around. I think that many people can actually link to psychoanalysis. What role does the unconscious play in existential therapy?
Yeah, first of all, of course, obviously the unconscious is a central concern in psychoanalysis, as it postulates the idea that emotional imbalance and neurotic symptoms are shaped by unconscious drives, conflicts, and the repression of conflicts. Existential therapy actually acknowledges the unconscious as well. So it's not that existential therapy would say, okay, the unconscious is something like a black box and we can deal with that, but it basically acknowledges that it's an important idea. But it's important to note that existential therapy basically sees this as a kind of, if you will, hiding place to avoid confronting the existential realities. So again, that's, although it uses the concept, and of course, as I've mentioned before, many of the central figures in existential therapy would basically stem from psychoanalysis. It's a hugely different idea or hugely different approach to the whole concept of the unconscious.
Okay.
And then maybe also in therapy itself, because the unconscious and also the concept of transference, they are kind of closely related to each other in psychoanalysis. And in psychoanalysis, the basic idea of transference is that client, or the patient as it would be called in psychoanalysis, projects unconscious feelings and conflicts and past relationships onto the therapist. And that is something, as I've already hinted, that existential therapists would at least be highly skeptical of, because it's something that is inauthentic, kind of trying to be neutral, to stimulate the client projecting something that is not basically aware of, that makes a kind of produces a situation that is actually not a natural situation, natural interaction. And instead, in existential therapy, transference might be used as a means to support the authentic relationship and to openly help clients understand their ways of relating to others. But it's way less in the way of kind of being passive and waiting for the client to project something on the therapist. It's something that is kind of explored together.
So it is welcomed somewhat.
Of course, it is also something that can be used to explore the existential givens together, but it is not used as something that is kind of a strategy to unmask unconscious structures that much.
Okay.
So, and also, I guess it's also important to realize that in any case, transference is not as central as it is in psychoanalysis. So although the term is also known in existential therapy and it is can be used, it's not something that is kind of an that essential for therapy, since therapy as a whole puts less emphasis on analytical interpretation in the first place, and is way more focused on mutual presence and understanding between two human beings in the here and now. And there, the whole concept of transference, of course, doesn't work that much in that setting.
Very different, actually, yeah.
Exactly, yes.
So previously you mentioned that there are 6 major differences that came to your mind that you see relevant between psychoanalysis and existential therapy. So now, if I'm counting correctly, and this is more a test for me now, but we talked about the tension, the relationship, the unconscious, and of course, right now, transference. It was. Right?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, you counted right. Yes.
So, to my calculations, there are 2 differences missing that you deem important. Would you please elaborate on those?
Yes, so I have to kind of count in my head. I go to my imaginative bullet point list. But yes. So, what is also extremely important, what is maybe one of the major differences, is the temporal aspect. That is kind of a very, very prominent difference between psychoanalysis and all kinds of existential approaches. Even there are also differences in that regard between different existential approaches, but still there in general, it's a huge difference. So even if many psychoanalysts may disagree and everyday practice may indeed differ from theory, in its very conception, psychoanalysis is basically focused on the past. Again, as I say, of course, if you would discuss with psychoanalysts, they would maybe disagree and say, but that's only one side of the coin and so forth. But in theory, it's a major focus on the past. And in contrast, existential therapy in existential therapy, there are different nuances when it comes to the temporal perspective in therapy. For example, Jalom prioritizes the here and now. In that regard, he's, for example, closer to the humanistic schools than to psychoanalysis, definitely. Frankl and May, in contrast, they are very much focused on the future, on the idea of projecting oneself into the future. And an existential exploration may even include what van Dersen calls the past before, that is the unseen, pre-conscious foundations of one's personal existence. That's also part of the existence. But again, the focus is on how that shapes present lived experience and not so far on kind of digging in kind of structures that have built up in the past. So to wrap that up, so with quite some nuances, existential exploration is not fixated on one temporal dimension, but it is rather open in that regard. And it definitely differs from the psychoanalytical kind of backward orientation in the temporal aspect.
Backward in the sense of past, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes. And then there will be kind of the 5th point on my list, if you will. And then the last and also very important question is etiology, basically the question where psychopathologies stem from. For psychoanalysis, the answer is clearly that they come from unconscious conflicts, repressed drives, and so forth. That's kind of a very superficial, but that's kind of the basic principle, if you will. And there we already see, even before we go into detail, we already see the differences to existential therapy, because in existential therapy, psychopathologies stem from the loss of meaning, basically, and from the avoidance of these existential givens that I've already mentioned. And that's a massive difference, obviously.
Yeah.
To elaborate on this, maybe one anecdote is useful that Frankl told about a client of his. There was a client who was a high-ranking official in some US government agency and who felt a deep dissatisfaction with his job. And this client had been in analysis for years, and his struggle had been interpreted by several psychoanalysts as a paternal conflict, father conflict. And in that interpretation, obviously, the US government was symbolizing the father. And then there were more and more symbolic values added to that interpretation. But basically no relief occurred. So didn't find any kind of relief in therapy. And then he came to Frankl, and Frankl basically quickly realized that the man's vocation simply didn't go along with his will to create meaning in his life. He didn't basically find meaning in his job. So there was actually no deep going attachment of symbols and no trying to dig in the relational past with the parents or whatsoever. That wasn't needed, but a simple life decision. So the man eventually changed his profession and became quite satisfied with his new life. In Frankl's words, existential distress is not a mental disease, but more often the unreflected inability to live an authentic life. That's the basic point. That's the basic outtake. And in that case, psychoanalytic symbolism had basically just blurred that relatively simple insight, if you will.
Yeah, just another approach needed for that man. Oh well. So now we have sorted out some of the differences, all 6 actually. Thank you for that. So now I would like to hear more about the actual characteristics of existential approaches. Like, at its core, what are the ideas, the beliefs, if you will?
Right. Well, as I've already mentioned, philosophy is very central to existential therapy. So again, as I've said in the beginning, it's not so much based on clinical trials or on kind of natural sciences and the mechanisms of the brain, if you will, in the widest sense. But also not on these psychodynamic ideas of repression and kind of the power dynamics of different players within the mind or the mind and the unconscious, if you will. And in terms of that philosophical base, it's important to distinguish between existential themes in a wider sense and existentialism as a more specific term. Although existentialism itself is far from being a homogeneous project. But again, still, there is a huge difference between existential themes in general. For example, philosophers like Plato or Socrates that contribute to existential ideas. But if I want to expand a little more on the basis of existential therapy, I'm going to stick with the existentialist thinkers in a narrower sense.
All right.
Because otherwise it's going to be,
5 hours long.
Exactly. We're not going to have that time. And also we would need a philosopher maybe there.
That would broaden the horizon for sure.
Yeah. So again, first to mention is, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche, whose notion that there is no higher being directing our fate. Back before Nietzsche, basically the idea was there is some kind of God. So even highly intellectual philosophers basically also tried to introduce the idea of God through the back door into their theories. And Nietzsche famously said, God is dead. So with that, he laid the groundwork for a concept of personal meaning. Another statement that of Nietzsche, he's often quoted by existential therapists, for example, Frankl, again, made it central to his writings, is Nietzsche saying, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow." That is a very central tenet of existential therapy or of existentialism in general. But as we see, it has already also therapeutic implications.
Absolutely.
Obviously, yeah. Then to mention would, of course, also be Søren Kierkegaard, who contributed the idea that anxieties are nothing pathological. We've already touched on that issue, that anxieties are not something pathological in itself, but rather they are the result of being confronted with the infinite possibilities of life. That means Kierkegaard emphasized the role of making choices. That is also something extremely central to existential therapy, and that is something that is basically borrowed from Kierkegaard. Then there is, of course, Martin Heidegger, who diagnosed existence as something that can only take place in the here and now, in the world we are thrown into, as he calls it, famously. And also existence as something that is always directed towards death, ultimately. I'm going to come back to that maybe a little later. Like Nietzsche, Heidegger also emphasized authenticity and the necessity to search for meaning. The name Heidegger is, of course, mainly associated with Daseins analysis. So it was kind of, Daseins analysis is kind of based on Heidegger's ideas. But he has also heavily influenced all the other approaches within existential therapy that I've mentioned before. So that's why he's very central. Then there's Karl Jaspers, who is actually a psychiatrist as well as a philosopher. He himself built on Nietzsche and Kierkegaard already, and maybe the most important concept in regard to existential therapy are the so-called boundary situations. Situations like experiencing guilt, suffering, or death, as these situations kind of reveal the existential givens that are otherwise repressed from everyday life. These are kind of opening gaps where we can basically look into the existential terrors that are usually kind of hidden from us due to all the defenses we build in everyday life to kind of hide from those. Another of these boundary situations would be, for example, experiencing the absurd or the paradoxical situations and contradictions of human existence. That is a motive that we, by the way, also find in the works of Sartre or Camus. Speaking of, Sartre himself has expanded existentialist ideas by his radical concept of freedom. We've already mentioned that freedom is also kind of central. So in Sartre's worlds, man is condemned to be free. And he also put much emphasis on the importance of exercising one's free will. And that idea is extremely important, for example, for Yalom and for existential therapy in general. So basically, Sartre would say denying oneself this freedom is, and pretending that one's existence is determined by external forces, that is what Sartre calls bad faith. That is a kind of central.
So that was quite a look into the philosophical part of it all. Still, this is all pretty much on an, very important, of course, but on an ideational level, right? So I think after all this information, which works so perfect in theory to me right now, I'm just kind of wondering if I were walking into the office of an existential therapist, what would I have to expect there? Like, what are the practical strategies that they're using? How does it all work?
Yeah, good point. I mean, we've already established a little bit about how kind of it would feel like, because we talked about the relationship, which is, of course, central. And first of all, it's maybe important to know that the framework of existential therapy is kind of flexible. It's non-prescriptive, and it also can be quite pragmatic. So usually existential therapists are not dogmatic in terms of, okay, what is not in the textbook is something that can be used for therapy. So they're relatively open to also to what we today call therapy integration, to also kind of pull in ideas or techniques from other schools. So what the basic strategies and tools that are used, in many cases, that's simply Socratic questions. Dialogue, these are the techniques of choice in a very general sense. So existential therapy or therapies are in that regard arguably a bit more focused on intellectual reflection, if you will, than if you, for example, compare them to person-centered therapy. But the idea of a dialogue between equals, that is again similar. So what's important is maybe it's a bit more on the level of intellectual considerations, but it's always important to keep in mind that it's a dialogue between equals. So there is never, as we've already established, there would be never that situation, no hierarchy of the therapist has the objective knowledge and can use that objective knowledge to interpret the situation. That is never going to be something within the scope of existential therapy.
Okay.
Then, of course, again, authenticity and the depth of the therapeutic relationships, these are very important. Yalom even goes so far saying that everything else that is done in therapy is just a means to fill the time until the relationship actually develops. But the relationship itself is where the healing takes place. I would say that this is again something where, for example, Carl Rogers would agree, basically. However, still there are, of course, some techniques that are kind of typical for existential therapies, like, for example, directly addressing existential anxieties. But there are also more behavior-oriented things like experiments, what we use called existential experiments. And again, something that is also well known from humanistic therapies that will be trying to engage with the here and now, with the situation, with the person you are sitting here and now in therapy.
So not so much on the past as we
again,
elaborated
yes,
on.
Exactly. That is something that, of course, also is important for the actual strategies employed. One of these tools or strategies that I personally find very intriguing is narrative reconstructions, where life stories are, or is try to kind of unfold life stories and then question these life stories for their potential, and also try to create maybe alternative or more empowering versions of these life stories. Because basically, in the way we experience life, it is not something that is that we experience as some kind of machine kind of rattling in our brain, and we have input and output. But when we experience life, we usually experience it as in a similar way as we would experience reading a book or something. There is that kind of self-narration that we talk about us, which role we play in our own life and so forth. So that is a very, very intriguing approach, I would say.
Is it like a change of point of view somehow?
Exactly. So it's also, of course,
how you look at it,
seeing different perspectives that you could actually imply into your own, and also giving you that's again a matter of choices, of freedom. Giving you the freedom, or letting you experience that you have the freedom, that you make that it is your own choice what your story is. That is maybe a good way to point it. But to come back to kind of the general techniques that we have, especially Frankl is known for the concept of the paradoxical intention. That is something to deliberately focus on fear, or even on the exaggeration of fear, in order to break the mechanism of giving fears power by avoiding them. Because sometimes people, as we know, begin to fear the fear more than the actual thing that stands behind it. That is something that is maybe not even too far away in the widest sense from behavioral therapy, just as a side note. And it's, of course, something that is usually more applicable for phobias or something, and not for deeper existential issues, as Frankl says himself. So it's, but of course, you have to deal, because it's kind of a general kind of therapy. You you have to deal with different kinds of problems, obviously, so you have to have different tools, and that is something that Frankl proposes for these kind of also more short term and more kind of focused on phobias or all the like. And yeah, then it's also again, that's also something that Frankl introduced. That is what he calls de-reflection. That is a technique to shift attention away from excessive self-focus and try to guide the individual to find meaning and purpose through external engagement rather than through introspection. And May and Yalom, for example, they also view excessive introspection and rumination as an obstacle to the process of self-transcendence and connection to the world. So they see that kind of only revolving around your inner issues, psychologizing everything that happens in your life as something that can even perpetuate narcissistic patterns or depression. Just as a side note, in regard to depression, again, Aaron Beck would basically take issue about the same aspect of psychoanalysis, this kind of rumination, digging deeper and deeper all the time and kind of revolving all around the bad stuff instead of trying to transcend it and to find meaning in other sections of your life.
Well, that totally makes sense. I think that's also something that many can relate to, this whole rumination process that just makes everything worse. So yeah. So I'm going to do a little swerve now somehow. As you surely know, of course, in Austria, existential therapy is part of the humanistic cluster of therapies. Now, I just want to hear your opinion about it. Do you find that classification useful?
That's a good question. Yeah, there are, we mostly touch differences between psychoanalysis and existential therapy, but also we briefly touch some differences between humanistic and existential therapies as well. And there are, of course, many. But nevertheless, I find that this classification in this common cluster makes sense, since there are also some very essential commonalities to be found between existential therapy and the humanistic school of thought.
Okay.
There is maybe a good way to outline the differences, but then also the commonalities. So let's try to put it that way. Yes. When you, for example, when you give a lecture about the paradigms of psychotherapy and to try to convey the central tenets of the humanistic schools, then some of the keywords you're going to use are going to be unconditional positive regard, congruence, self-actualization, awareness, integration, responsibility, wholeness, and so forth. You name it, you have it. Well, then, and because they are in the same cluster, obviously, then the next kind on your slides, on your presentation, are going to be existential therapy, for example, Yalom. And then the keywords are going to be meaninglessness, isolation, death, freedom. So it's not hard to imagine why existential therapy is considered by many as the more, if you will, gloomy cousin of positive psychology. You want it darker, to say with Leonard Cohen.
Oh, I like the reference. I also do like the term gloomy cousin. I really do see it, especially when you name them so close together. I can't help but recognize freedom in there, of course, with all the death and stuff going on. But I also can't get it out of my head. You were talking about, and I forgot his name, something,
Kierkegaard.
Yeah, you mentioned something about anxieties and how they are related for him with the infinite possibilities of life. Thank you very much. Which immediately makes the paradox of choice jump to my mind. Does that belong in there? like with the freedom stuff.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly the point. So usually, when you come with these existential givens, then you have these kind of meaningless isolation, death, and so forth. And then comes freedom, and freedom.
Right.
Everybody would say, "Oh yes, at least freedom. That is something positive." But exactly as you've pointed out, in terms of existential therapy, freedom, of course, means kind of the terror of experiencing infinite choices you have to make in life. But so it's also something that is a huge challenge, and not something where you can say, okay, now comes freedom, now I can relax.
Now I can chill.
So I've kind of, I've dealt with all the others, isolation, death, and meaninglessness, and now I can. But it's not, it's also meant in a way that it's a huge existential challenge, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so basically, when we come back to the comparison or to the question whether the humanist and the existential therapies, whether it's a good idea to put them in a common cluster, I would say that while the themes that are used to start the process of therapy obviously differ, there are some fundamental commonalities, since both schools are experiential in the widest sense in their very nature, and both schools value, for example, authenticity, freedom, responsibility, personal growth, meaning, subjectivity, and so forth. You name it, you have it. So there are, of course, also a lot of key terms that you could basically, when you just see these terms before you, you couldn't say whether you're reading an excerpt about humanistic therapy or existential therapy, because they are similar. So, of course, the ways to achieve these goals, the actual themes and techniques in therapy, they may be different, but in the most general sense, at least, there are less conflicting ideas between humanistic and existential thinking than there are between existential and psychoanalytic or any other group of approaches. So I would say, to wrap that up in humanistic terms, the goal is achieved by self-actualization. That is maybe one of the central goals of course, there are also different schools within the humanistic cluster. Mm-hmm. And in existential therapy, the focus is more on dealing with these existential givens, with these existential concerns as such.
I want to harp on to that, because you've mentioned the existential givens. You've mentioned those quite on a few occasions throughout our talk so far. Can you maybe elaborate a little on these? Like, what is it?
So yeah, the existential givens or existential concerns, as they're also called. Well, that is actually what I find so intriguing about existential therapy or existentialism thinking in general. There are these complicated philosophical concepts. So I dare say reading Heidegger isn't fun, at least for, I would say, most of us.
Sorry to anyone who enjoys it.
Yeah, well, I know some people who would actually enjoy it, but I would say they're the minority, so it's really hard to read, basically. Yeah, but at the same time, when we basically grasp what these philosophers say, they're dealing with these simple, I would say, to some regard, also almost obvious fundamentals of life. And while these fundamentals are universally true, because everybody, for example, has to die or whatsoever, yes. At the same time, there are as many strategies to deal with these fundamentals, with these givens, as there are people in the world, basically. So it's something that is extremely universal, but on the other hand, it's extremely personal and it's completely individual. So you're never going to find two ways to deal with these general existential givens or two persons who can deal with them in the exactly same way.
Right.
So existential therapy is basically in that regard an approach that fully appreciates the uniqueness of every client. So there is no relying on every generalized idea of mechanisms or something in the widest sense, biological or deterministic sense. But at the same time, existential therapy builds on these existential givens that we are all subject to. That is again something that is completely universal. There is no human being that is not subject to existential givens.
And yet again, what are the existential givens?
Okay, yeah, we're kind of
but I do agree, of course.
Talking in circles maybe a little. Okay, yeah, so again, what are the existential givens? So if we follow Jalom or von Dersen, for example, then the existential givens, or again, existential concerns, as they're also called, are basically these aforementioned dimensions of death, meaninglessness, isolation, freedom. I would say it's kind of obvious why death is an existential concern. I guess nobody quite likes death, and usually we prefer to keep death away from our everyday lives. I guess we don't have to expand on that.
Agreed.
And of course, also we like to personalize death to some regard sometimes. Yeah, so we have all these kind of strategies. But of course, in existential terms, it's not only our own death we have to deal with, but it's also about loss in general, about the finiteness of being in general, not only about our own kind of biological, physical death.
Yeah. It's funny because that's the first thing I thought about, death of others, not my own somehow.
Exactly, yeah. So of course that's also an issue that is maybe, for example, for depressive people, it's maybe way more relevant. Yeah, to be afraid of death of others than the own death, which is kind of in some regard maybe even desired. Yeah, for example. So that's of course when we use the term death, it's a huge concept that embraces of course many different dimensions here in the existential sense.
Yes.
But still, again, we can agree there are different perspectives. There might be different approaches to that by different individuals, but basically we are all subject to finiteness of our being in the world. That is something
correct, right?
We can't escape that. Yeah, basically it's something existential therapy has to deal with, that we basically go to great lengths to try and avoid the uncomfortable truth that everything is just basically dust in the wind, and that our being in the world isn't important if we don't make it important for someone. Of course, as a side note, religion is a collective version of one of those strategies, because it's often promising some kind of immortality. But there are, of course, also neurotic expressions on the individual level of that death anxiety in the widest sense.
Because you just said something that really struck me, that death is really about giving meaning to it by others.
Exactly. So all these existential givens are
like making it important for somebody.
They are all connected. So this anxiety that arises from the notion that our being in the world is of limited time can only be alleviated by introducing any kind of meaning into that time.
Right.
And that meaning is in many cases because also we as human beings are not specifically important to the universe. The universe doesn't care about us.
Correct.
So it's important that somebody cares about us. That's why also relationship is very central.
Yeah. I just read this story about a guy some time ago that he was found on the side of the road and he lost all his memory. And they were sending his face out on the news, but nobody knew him. So it was totally suddenly there was no meaning to him anymore. He didn't know his name and stuff like that. And my thought was just he could have died right there and then, and it would have just been like dust in the wind, as you said. Just that giving meaning to somebody in their death makes it meaningful in itself somehow.
Exactly. So, and of course, that is a thought that is very uncomfortable for basically all of us.
Right.
Yeah,
Sorry, I totally interrupted you. Anyway.
Yeah. So again, so we have, as I said, there are also again apart from religion, there are also neurotic expressions of that kind of death anxiety. For example, Jalom speaks about that concept that is very central for him, that he calls the ultimate rescuer. That is basically when individuals believe that any kind of entity will come and eventually save them from death, or also from other kinds of existential concern. So that can be a deity, for example, or some kind of impersonal fate, or even a real person to kind of use with, because it's a huge difference whether you have a relation with an actual person in order to experience your own finiteness together, or if you try to really fuse with another person in order to make yourself to gain some kind of immortality. So that is also something that is a kind of neurotic expression of death anxiety. But again, when we talk about all these also neurotic structures and so forth, it's important to note that from the viewpoint of existential therapy, this is not seen as a pathological structure that needs to be totally overcome, but as an opportunity to reinterpret beliefs that are so much embraced, to reinterpret them towards self-empowerment. That's basically, so it's not about kind of trying to overrule and break these defenses. It's to work with them.
Okay. At the beginning, you mentioned within the existential givens, besides death and something like that, you mentioned meaninglessness, I think.
Mm-hmm. So it's maybe meaning or meaninglessness, because it kind of amounts to the same, is maybe the most central and important term to understanding existential therapy. It's kind of a key concept. There are, of course, differences in regard to different schools. For example, while Frankl speaks about the search for meaning, and for him, meaning is the most central concept that basically encapsulates all the other existential givens, all the other dimensions. Yalom more emphasizes that rather it's necessary to confront the inherent meaninglessness of life. So there are nuances in that regard. But anyway, meaninglessness or meaning, these are kind of central aspects, because meaninglessness doesn't mean anything else than you have to create meaning yourself.
Yes.
That's so again, that maybe sound like two totally contrary concepts at first glance, but eventually they both point at life as something that doesn't present us with a general purpose. Life is not something that has a purpose or has something in store for us. What is our role? What is our purpose? But rather we must find or construct meaning for ourselves. That is again kind of the gist of existentialism or existentialist philosophy. That is, of course, all not detached from our social and material environment, from the spiritual realm. But eventually, it can be valid only for us as an individual. And of course, meaning is also the concept kind of connecting all the other givens of existence. As I've said, that's especially for Frankl. He doesn't even kind of specify these givens of existence, but also subsumes them more under the term of meaning. Because there is no meaning without finiteness, because if we hadn't, we wouldn't know that our being in the world is something that will end someday. There would be no meaning in doing anything at all. So meaning is basically connected to the idea of death. And there is also no meaning without willing. If you don't want anything, if you don't strive for anything, then there is no meaning. And that means meaning and making choices, these are kind of extremely closely connected, both in a philosophical way, but also in therapeutical practice. And there is also this existential concern of isolation. And I guess that's something that is, again, similar like death. We tend to put aside the uncanny truth that as conscious individuals, we are always going to be unable to fully share our experience. What we are in one moment in one point of time is something that only we are. Of course, we can talk about it. Yeah, we can have loved ones where we share important aspects of our life, but still we are in that regard isolated, because nobody can ever have the same experience as another person. Even if you're, I don't know, twins, for example, even they have different experience.
Yes.
So nobody will ever truly feel what we feel, see what we see and have seen. So we have our own individual spot in the material world as well as in the symbolic world. And that ultimately means that we are alone. That is basically the flip side of individuation that we have, that we, of course, experience more in the modern or postmodern society than if you would compare it to the Middle Ages or even some ancient cultures. And like death, this often unreflected certainty of being alone that releases, of course, a huge amount of anxiety. And like it is with death, it is only natural that we develop defenses against that uncomfortable certainty. And again, existential therapists won't try to do away with neither the anxiety itself, nor with the tension it creates, but rather use the tension and direct clients towards reflecting and reframing their defense strategies and consciously use the tension, the knowledge of that existential given of being alone, to use their freedom to make choices that actually help their growth and help them, living a better life.
So with all this information and all the elaborations you did on the existential givens now, it's a lot, but taken into consideration, what would be your conclusion to all of this?
Well, I would say that accepting these givens eventually amounts to embracing freedom. That's kind of the main outtake. And freedom is not meant as a hedonistic feel-good term, but rather as taking the burden of responsibility. Again, freedom is not something that is just, free, cool, yeah, but it's taking the burden of responsibility to take the helm of one's own life. That is maybe, I would say, also in my own opinion or my own experience, that is maybe the hardest task we face in life. But it is, in terms of existential therapy, also the most rewarding. So acknowledging that we always have a choice. Frankl describes the situation where everything is taken from a human being. Its loved ones, its human rights, its belongings, its status, its health, everything. Its physical strength even its individuality, everything is taken. But even in that unimaginable darkness where everything is taken from a person, in that hellish man-made nothingness, obviously Frankl refers to the concentration camps and to his experience there. Frankl says that man can choose to remain a person, to maintain his or her dignity, and by making this choice, turn all that pointless suffering into a little spark of meaning. And I find that is very inspiring thought and something. So again, even though existential therapy may, as we've put it, sound a little gloomy and sound maybe a little less upbeat and positive than the humanistic schools of thought, that's actually just a starting point. Openly facing the existential givens and standing your ground instead of hiding from them is something that can be very, very enriching for one's life, I would say. So that would be my outtake from existential therapy.
And I think very, very beautiful words to the end of this podcast today with you, Manuel. That was very insightful, and actually very, very pleased to have you here a second time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And I will invite you a third time if you come up with a new topic.
Yeah, I will think about it. So,
even though I see you could talk even more about this.
I
and
could maybe.
It is interesting. I totally see why.
It's really
nuanced,
fascinating. And maybe I will come up with. I'm actually working on maybe kind of...
I totally see the glimmer in your eyes already.
Because we've talked about conspiracy theories in the
Yes.
last podcast, and now I'm very much into existential therapy. So yeah, maybe we'll do something connecting these two dots. But yeah, we will see about that.
Well, perfect. I will contact you. So thank you very much. And yeah,
Thank you.
see you soon.
See you.
This concludes episode 5 of our Sigmund Freud Privatuniversitäts podcast. I really hope you enjoyed the change in, let's say, linguistic scenery. Especially, of course, I hope this also finds our non-German speaking audience. Either way, I figure that we will incorporate more English podcasts in the future. If you have feedback or requests for future guests or anything of that sort, feel free to leave me a message in my mail inbox. You can find the address in the show notes. Either way, thank you for tuning in today. I hope you've gained a new insight. I hope it was entertaining for you. And most of all, I hope you'll join in again with me, Cheyenne Scheuch. Until then, stay curious and adieu.